The comfortable behaviors probably are accelerating their decline, as you're describing here, because they're no longer relevant in the new context. The world has changed, technology's changed, customer demand has changed, and yet you're still executing the practices of a paradigm that no longer exists anymore.
This is Straight Talk in the COVID economy, and my name is Larry Quick. Our world has changed and there's no going back. The COVID economy is now very real. We are adapting to telework, Zooming, online learning and new industries like PanSafe and other opportunities revealed by COVID-19. The challenges are also with us: bankruptcies, unemployment, debt and confusion. In Straight Talk in the COVID economy, we meet thinkers and innovators who bring insight and information into the opportunities and risks of our rapidly emerging COVID economy. Straight Talk in the COVID economy is brought to you by Resilient Futures. This is alongside our partner, Impact Africa Network. Impact Africa Network is a non-profit startup studio in Nairobi on a mission to ensure young talented Africans have a chance at participating in the digital transformation of Africa as creators and owners. If grassroots change is something that excites you, visit www.impactafrica.network. By doing that, you'll be able to support, as donors and mentors, the Impact Africa Network.
Hi, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm very, very pleased to be with Barry OReilly today. I've been taken by his new book, Unlearn, which is just opened up a whole bevy of things, questions and answers to what we believe is a really essential part of how you come to terms with the COVID economy and any particular large disruption, particularly a global disruption such as this. So, hi Barry, how are you doing?
Great, Larry. Delighted to be here. Thanks again for inviting me on. Looking forward to a fun and lively conversation, I expect.
I think with that, Barry's obviously from San Francisco. Not really. He's an Irishman lived in London and also lived in Melbourne for some time. And that's a great universal experience, given that I've actually lived in Perth, Melbourne, then I went to live in Nottingham, London, Spain for a brief while, and then back to Australia, Melbourne, Providence, Rhode Island, and then back to Victoria. So we've been following each other. I think you've been stalking me, actually, Barry, but I won't talk about that.
Thanks very much.
So let me just tell you a bit about Barry. But just Google Barry, and you'll find a lot that is very, very useful. So Barry's mission is to help purposeful, technology-led businesses innovate at scale. He works with business leaders and teams that seek to invent the future, not fear it, and that's right up our alley. The future is not to be feared. It's something that we can work with. If you fear something, you're never going to go near it. But I think Barry and his work embraces that. He's been an entrepreneur, employee, and consultant, and after several startups, he shifted towards the enterprise. And that intersection, which is a really important intersection between business model innovation, and that's profit model innovation, if you like, as well as product development, organizational design, and culture transformation. And that really shows off the importance of a whole system in an organization. You can't just work in one area. You have to be understanding that, in our view, say innovation around business model innovation, product development, all go together, but the organisation has to deliver that through its design and its culture. Now, he's authored 2 international bestsellers, of which I'm a fan of both. The first one you'll know Barry from is The Lean Enterprise, How High Performance Organizations Innovate at Scale, a groundbreaking book, and one that's on my shelf. And a new one, which is Unlearn, Let Go of Past Success to Achieve Extraordinary Results. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, but that is a must-read book. I don't have a copy of it to show you right now, but if you go to any of your preferred booksellers, you'll see it there. He's obviously an international sought-after keynote speaker. I caught him briefly on I think it was a Cisco presentation just done recently, and that was great. I think it's up on the web. Go and have a look at it. Also contributed to one of my favourite magazines, The Economist, and Strategy Plus Business, and the MIT Sloan Management Review. He's also on the faculty of Singularity University with that bunch in San Francisco and throughout the globe. So Barry, welcome once again. Thank you for being here. For today, I thought what would be a good idea is that just a bit of background, the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's seen a massive drop-off in organisational performance, like that's gone bang, 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 bang. And what we tend to see in this type of environment where performance drops very quickly over time, it's like a very brief time. This has happened globally, so it can happen sometimes in very short bursts in certain geographic locations based on local conditions. But this is a global thing. It's not something that is easily sort of shrugged off, because COVID-19 is a pandemic in all its force in a globalized economy, different to the 1819 pandemic, the Spanish flu, where there was very little, a lot of transmission throughout the world as a pandemic, mainly because of soldiers returning home from the First World War. But obviously today what we've had is such a globally connected supply chain and holiday makers, and business travel, through airline travel, etc., that have made it very, very difficult to contain. And also in great large countries that are used to internal transport, it's very, very hard to contain with people spread out all over the place. And very, very hard to identify a vaccine, even though there's a lot of people trying to do that. It's more than likely going to take some time to do it. So the COVID economy has emerged very, very quickly. And that's from a learning and unlearning perspective, where we know what was happening in 2019, the good, the bad, and the not so good, the ugly, if you like. Now we have another set of situations where the information of the past isn't necessarily the information of the future in the COVID economy. So that, the unlearning part for me, Barry, is that we're not working at the moment, not just with skills, it's about mindset, skill set and strategic focus. We're still focusing on what was the past rather than what needs to be the future. And that gets to the idea of the book, which is, let go of past success to achieve extraordinary results by unlearning. So, and what we said, and what we talked about this before we started, is that when you go down in performance and you continue to go down and you can't quite get anything to work, you start investing in business as usual, which is business gone bad now. So, I think you said in one of your points on retail was that, don't try and make just the retail experience better. You've got to change the whole notion of what retail is. So, I'd open up by saying that, what we are very, very aware of is madness, MAD, managed adaptive decline, where you throw good money after bad by investing in things to try and get back to what you were before, but really it's not the place to go. So you have to deal with that complexity. And I was speaking to Rebecca Costa just recently, and she said, one of her statements is, we have to learn to deal with complexity, which is basically learning new things. We have to deal with that complexity in picoseconds. We have to really get good at dealing with complexity. So my opening question for Barry was, how do you unlearn as a way of learning and relearning when things are changing so fast?
Yeah, I think one of the key sort of prompts for me to help people even diagnosed or in that situation is I really get them to think about, are they clear on the outcomes they're actually trying to achieve? Most of the time, people, when they're responding to a decline or a shock to the system, they are in chaos, or they don't know exactly what to do. So you have these two notions. You have the people that stop, freeze, pause, wait and see what happens, and that, which is a massive problem in itself. Because with a lot of this stuff, you have to learn your way through it, right? Complexity, uncertainty, when you don't know what the right answer is, you can't wait. You can't stop. You like all these companies that are stopping production in COVID, stopping innovating, pausing big initiatives, pausing. They're not going to learn anything through this situation. They might see what other companies do and try and replicate that, but it's what another company is really learning. They're just trying to copy. So I think a lot of what I get the leaders to get focused on is what are some of the real outcomes that they actually are aiming for. And then asking them the simple questions, right? Like, where are you not living up to those expectations? Where are you struggling to achieve the outcomes? Where are you tried everything you can think of and you're not getting the breakthrough you're looking for? Is there situations you're avoiding? These are all signals that when you have those types of challenges that are spawned from not getting your outcomes, from struggling to come up with a solution, avoiding situations, or tried everything you can think of, they're all signals that your existing behavior and thinking is not working. And maybe to your point, that's where people go to what's known to them. They stick to what's comfortable. And yet the comfortable behaviors probably are accelerating their decline, as you're describing here, because they're no longer relevant in the new context. The world has changed, technology's changed, customer demand has changed, and yet you're still executing the practices of a paradigm that no longer exists anymore. So you're sort of almost accelerating down to your madness idea. And I think that's a tough part for leaders to recognize, these sort of inflection points. Is when do I realize I need to make the change? And to do that, you need to have a system in place. And the way we know how to explore uncertainty and complexity as safely as possible is to get clear on the outcomes we're aiming for, and then run or take small steps or experiments to learn our way towards the direction we believe is correct. And anyone can build that system into the way they operate, but I think sometimes that goes out the window when there's chaos and uncertainty. People panic, or they stick to what they've always done. And that sadly, most organizations in the situation that's been triggered by COVID are really going to struggle, because the paradigm they think exists no longer exists. Their behaviors that maybe worked in the past, will they work in the future? Or they're just freezing and waiting to see what happens. So they're not learning anything, or they're not creating information to understand what to do. I think any companies in those scenarios are in real trouble, and creating it for themselves, if we're honest. I think the very specific types of companies I work with, or leaders I look for, are the people that see uncertainty as opportunity, that manage uncertainty by thinking big and starting small, taking small steps to learn what works, what doesn't, recoverable situations, and build the capability to explore uncertainty in a systematic and safe manner. And I'll happily share lots of examples of that as we go on in the show, but that's what wins. And we're only going to have more and more shocks to the system, more unanticipated shocks to the system. So if you haven't built this muscle to continuously adapt to changing circumstances, to learn your way through uncertainty, you're really going to struggle.
That's when you talk about build muscle, it's sort of like what we talk about in our methodology, strategy, and action is building an internal sort of algorithm, taking on an internal algorithm where uncertainty is the norm. And you hear it often when people say, well, you're not going to get mining companies to invest, or whatever large company is, they're not going to invest unless they've got certainty. And my sort of sense of that is, when was there ever certainty? Particularly when you look at exponential change across factors like, degrading planet, a financial services system that serves, that has by its own volition centered wealth in such a small corner. So, you've got liquidity breakdown. That's liquidity's just collapsed. And people are hoarding money. The 1%ers in America um, haven't allowed the flow of capital to let labour grow, if you want to put it in those terms. So there's an immense amount of uncertainty already. I just wonder if it's people don't understand that having certainty is a pretty BS thing to have, you know.
Yeah, but I think, one of the things we talk a lot about in the book is people's conditioning, right? Your leadership conditioning. And to many people, we've been sort of sold the certainty dream to a certain extent, right? Like you'll be successful on the project if you deliver it on time, on budget, on scope, if you manage your output.
Yeah.
And a lot of that harks back to industrial era world where, you had one or two educated people. They did all the thinking, broke work down into discrete tasks and handed it out to people to execute. And the way they monitored or measured productivity was the amount of work that was executed. And so there's you're doing repeatable problems, right? You're making nuts and bolts in a factory line. You're making a car. There's low variability in the product that you're creating, because you decide what that product is and you push it to the market. I think the world we operate in now is the absolute inverse of that. The dynamics outside of your control are much stronger forces. So customer demand changes, technology changes, public health issues change the way that we operate. And so, you're more of a ship at sea, just trying to guide your way to where you're trying to go, where before you could actually dictate, if you'd be in land and water. And it's just very different sort of dynamics. But most people are still trained in management schools on theories around executing work. The amount of execs I work with and coach in Fortune 500 companies who've built their brand on delivering on time or never are perfect results, or it's just very difficult for them to understand that the control has changed, and the control they need to create is actually through experimentation, testing and learning, and being good at describing goals, setting good constraints, having a good values that you want your work to be executed by, and then making space for people to explore paths to get there. And like there's the companies that are the biggest companies in the world now, are they're very intentionally designed to make that happen. When you go into Amazon, there are leadership principles. There's 14 of them. They're the values, the principles, the behaviors that they ask people to live by day to day. And they're not just up on the wall. People live them, right? So when you're sitting in a meeting, people will say, are we thinking big enough about this? If they're having lots of debate and it's going around in circles, somebody will say, can we disagree and commit to just one path and testing this for a short period of time? Like they live these sort of principles, and that's what allows these ideas to permeate through that company. Bezos he actually was a hedge fund manager before he got into Amazon. He knows about optionality. He knows about making bets in the market, recognizing some will fail and the ones that return will have 100 times X return all the failures that you've had, because you're investing in information. You're investing in finding out, should we keep doing this, stop doing this, or do something different? And I think a lot of people are still talk about in like return on investment, which again is a ridiculous question to ask in innovation, because you've no idea when you make a bet what the return is going to be. But what you want to ask yourself is, what do I want to learn from this bet? And how is that going to inform the next bet I make? Where I think what people still are harking on is that I've given you money, now where's my thing?
Yeah.
I want it better deliver on what you said it would. I want it better deliver on all these financial returns you promised it would. And that's just trying to predict the future with no information, which is not control at all.
Well, so many thoughts. I'm just thinking Taylor's got a lot to answer for in his Theory X. He was a Theory Xer, wasn't he? And if you think about that industrial viewpoint that's been brought through into an age which was completely different as to when he actually made that assertion. We just, in my lifetime, was born in 1950, but I just think back to my first job in a bank, which was all manual. You know, there was nothing that didn't even know what a computer was. No one knew what a computer was. But you know, if you think about what you said there in terms of innovation, we talk about in strategy and action. The output of a strategy in action is a catalytic action, where you test the conditions to see what the return is. So you've made a decision to take certain catalytic actions to build a capability. You test that with an experiment, and you continue to test the conditions, and you have a mindset that allows you to change rapidly based on feedback, rather than we're going to go in there all guns blazing. And it's sort of like, if you put it into sort of military parlance, it's not D-Day necessarily, it's guerrilla warfare. And the sort of D-Day, I hate to talk in military terms, but the D-Day experience that is now tends to be the American view of war, has never won since the Second World War. It's been little guerrilla tactics that test conditions and do what makes best at the time. So moving right away from the war analogy, it's sort of picking up on that experimentation, catalytic action. How do you understand what's going on enough to make a catalytic action test whether that's actually there? And I love what you said about, the Amazon 14 principles are really worth looking at, because as a guiding principles, I think at least they work for Amazon. Return on investment, a ridiculous concept in innovation, I can't agree more, is what we're going to do is we're going to try something completely different that's never been done before, really, or even if it's a minor deviation, but it's got to produce. And I remember working with our local tech company, telecom here, you'd know them, Telstra. And we did an innovation project, and they said that the innovations needed to deliver at least $100 million in net profit. And I said, well, we're going to do this project, and anything that comes out, it's got to produce $100 million. Yes, that's just not worth doing. And I said, but what happens if you've got something that could produce $10 million that opens up to something that produces $50 million that opens up something that can produce $1 billion? And, you know, that time we did that, it was looking at how you use text, you know, and sort of like that's in the days, you know, I think 3G had just come out and text was available. So, you know, a company like Telstra has never produced an innovation in its life. It basically hasn't got away from being a utility, as opposed to other telecoms that have done fantastic work in that area. You know, our telecoms industry here is really under threat because it still plays out the old telecommunications narrative. And that is that we provide pipes for bits of information. But that's, we've just put the NBN in here, and they're going to 5G. They have no services to go on top of it that they own. They've imported all the services from Google, etc. So, you know, you've got a classic example of an organisation that can't unlearn itself and will take itself into huge investments in 5G, which, you know, it's going to happen. You know, you've got Amazon, Google, Tesla putting up these arrays of communication satellites up there that, you know, 5G will support 5G, but it creates the lowest common denominator bandwidth seller for a Telstra. You know, what are the services they're going to have value add on top of that? You know, it's sort of like a classic example of ROI being a ridiculous concept. And, you know, using innovation is the next thing to learn. It's finding out the next thing to learn, making those probes.
Yeah, I think that's the most important part. And again, it goes back to setting up this system of like, what's the outcomes you're aiming for? You know, like it's very easy and comfortable for companies to keep doing what's known to them, right? No one's going to get fired for improving the quality of the speed on a pipe on communications data, right? They're following the trend of new technology innovation becomes available. Oh, look, everybody seems to be going from coppered wires to fiber. Let's put fiber in the ground. And you know, like it's activity for sure, but I think and you know it's needed to be done to stay like at pace at what technology innovations are. But you're not thinking about and as Amazon would say, thinking bigger about what are the opportunities here. Like how are having some of this infrastructure in place? What are some of the trends you're seeing in customer behavior? What are the trends you're seeing in geopolitical movements? Where are people working? What are they doing differently? How are they responding? And you know, to your point on COVID, right? There's a reason some companies have not even skipped a beat with the transition to remote working, and other companies have found it incredibly difficult, right? Because they've never designed their organization to have flexible working, to allow people, you know, have access to simple things like their email from home. Maybe some people didn't want it. You know, it's like, why I work in the office. Why would I ever need that? Or, you know, so I'm part of a lot of CIO groups of Fortune 500 companies, and many of them were thinking about how do we get people laptops so they can just actually work from home. Or one case study I wrote with Tesco's Bank was how they were able to stand up their customer support support literally in 3.5 weeks when they had to move everybody remotely. And you know, you now have support staff working at home where they have to access systems that were currently behind closed doors, are not exposed to the outside world. And you know, there's a lot of challenges that these companies have to respond to. And you know, many companies who were just reticent to ever not let people be in the factory, because if they left the factory, how can we monitor what work they're doing? You know, and I think, you know, one of the gifts maybe of COVID is that the organizations that have set themselves up well, that are outcome focused, that are focused on performance, not productivity, they're focused on achieving the outcomes they're aiming for, how people get there, giving them more control about how they might do that. You know, one of the healthcare companies I work with, for years, they were like, you know, we can't let our support staff work from home. They need to be in the office. They'll be less productive. And, you know, with a task like that, where you know, the metrics are well understood, average call handling time, close rates, open rates, to, you know, all of this sort of knowns, you know, when they move people to force them to have to work remotely, they actually saw productivity improvements because people had more focus on when they were working at home. They didn't have to commute places, and they knew all the metrics to manage to because they were well understood. So it didn't matter where people were. Teams knew the impact of the effort that they were making, and was it maintaining the level of performance that they had before. So like, you'd given people the tools, the, you know, measurements, the dashboards, to tell them, are they moving at the right speed? Are they still doing things the same way that they were? All these guides rails were in place, or conditions, maybe as you might describe them, and they're just given to people and let them own them and be accountable for them. You know, and then people do great work. And yet, you know, and so many of the notions go against that, is to keep people in the office, in the factory, make sure they're at their desk at 9, you know, make sure they work late if they're behind. How long was that lunch break you took? Why are you talking to that person over there? Like, all of this ridiculous stuff that has really no bearing other than just demotivating people in the way they work and managing their output and activity. It's just such a failed system. And again, at the time, maybe when Taylor again defined what he thought to be successful at that stage, they were good models at that stage. We were doing repeatable manual work that we were trying to automate, you know. So sure, break down the tasks into smaller discrete units and execute them. Makes sense, but we're just not doing that work anymore. And yet people are still holding on to those mental models of the world. And that's like when people miss these unlearning moments. The world has changed, and yet they're using methods and mindsets from a legacy, an outdated or no longer exists paradigm. But yet that's all they've ever been conditioned to. And I think, whether it's a company like Telstra, as you've described, or any organizations that's not actively investing in getting outside their comfort zone, getting outside and experiencing what new technologies mean for their business, investing and finding out what they could potentially yield, they're just going to miss out. And they will be left, as you described, with, like holding on to the real utility, the parts of the business that nobody else wants to manage. And look, as soon as these satellite networks are up and running, like they're going to be able to connect to more people. You're less physically constrained by space. You don't have to dig up the roads. The whole thing changes again. And yet, you're going to be left. And this might not be a great situation where a lot of infrastructure that society relies on will be owned by a few private companies, right? And that will only accelerate more centralization of wealth. And is that right? What's the right balance? And so there's a lot of sort of stuff to happen here. And if we're not intentional about how we design the systems around how these businesses are created and how they're acting, and so it's in our interest to foster innovation in all companies, to keep competition in place, to keep creativity open, to offer alternative solutions and paths, because otherwise, again, today we're here on like August 25th, and the top 5 companies in the S&P 500 account for 20% of the value of the whole stock market, which is Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, and Microsoft. And we haven't had that concentration of wealth in 50 years from the 70s. And so again, I think there's a lot that we need to start asking ourselves here, that we should really be encouraging innovation everywhere. Otherwise, we might end up with a society in a situation we don't actually all want.
Well, and that was I think, progressing something that we've already got, if you look at concentration of wealth at the moment. And we talked about this at the opening, that or our start, where we think that where you have concentration of wealth, and that's controlled wealth. So you have controlled liquidity. It's sort of like all the water is in one dam, and that gets to choose where the water goes. So you're, when people say trickle-down economics, is the way to go, that's constraining innovation and controlling and centralising innovation that can happen around capital. If you don't open those faucets up to let the water out, so it can fertilise, if you like, or grow different parts of different in people's ideas and thinking, etc., you're going to get very stagnated economy. So I think your point on foster innovation to keep concentration, and looking at the concentration of wealth is a critically important part, particularly when you look at the impending economic breakdown that's coming very, very soon, as the real second wave of the social economic impacts of the COVID economy, of COVID-19. But it is part of the COVID economy is that, a shake-up is coming. If you look at, you talked about it in terms of more shocks coming. This is sort of COVID-19 related, but not COVID-19 as necessarily the specific cause. When you've got the collapse of financial systems. I mean, the stock market in America is going crazy at the moment. I think it's just basically out of control on wish lists and whims. But if you look at liquidity in terms of debt, if there's debt somewhere, someone's got to own the debt. So that concentration of wealth owns a lot of debt that is sovereign and domestic, which it all ends up being domestic. Taxpayer debt plus home household debt. I wonder to get your thoughts on unlearning the old economic model.
Well, I think that's a massive question to answer in 5 minutes. I'll be honest. But I think we there's always a balance, right? Like the people that take the risk, who start businesses, who are entrepreneurial in nature, to create in the world. There's a nobleness in that, and that's what they're seeking to do. Now, should they be so well remunerated that they have, millions and billions of dollars, like of capital sitting in a bank account that will never be used? That doesn't really make sense to me. Not everybody has the opportunity, to your dam analogy, to even be entrepreneurial when they're just trying to survive because they're in such poverty and difficult situations. So I think what's much more interesting to me is how we give everybody opportunity, and so we don't have such inequality. And I think that's what forces the anger for people.
Yeah.
In many ways we have a lot to be thankful for Jeff Bezos and what he has managed to create in the world. And at the same time, it's not good enough that huge populations of the planet have no access to clean water or are hungry every day. That's not acceptable either. And I think we need to fix that. And it's like, that's one of the reasons I really like this idea of the global grand challenges that Singularity represents. I like the sustainability goals that the UN has tried to put on top of mind for people. And, COVID provides us with an opportunity to be at our best in a crisis, to learn how we cope with that. And, we've seen throughout the globe, some people have led and been impeccable. I think the New Zealand government did an amazing job as an example of that, for instance. Other countries, not so good. I'm here in the US, where at times, you wonder, have people given up on trying to actually solve this crisis? And so it's tough, and there are 17 sustainability goals that the UN have identified, from poverty to education to things that really matter, and COVID isn't even one of those, and so we have a chance to learn again through this crisis to be better prepared for the future, because we have much more bigger challenges, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's poverty, whether it's education for all, inequality. These are big problems that we're not going to solve on our own. No one country is going to solve them. No one person is going to solve them. So I think we need to start thinking more about, and this notion of thinking bigger, like push up for bigger goals, because then everybody can get behind them, rather than small localized goals like, can I be richer than the person beside me? Or,
Yes.
Can I have a bigger exit than the company down the road? Or, these things sort of just become trivial then when you start to think about bigger and think about societal problems, systemic level problems, and then everybody can get behind them. So I think that's more my nature of these things, is the unlearning is probably to stop being so individualistic and start thinking bigger about societal level, system level challenges, and how you can start small and individually contribute to solving those bigger systemic level problems.
I'm interested also on a tweet that you put up, and before I go to that tweet, there's one thing that we've recognised very well throughout the years in studying disruption, is that when you get severe drop-off, whether it can be localised drop-off or like one organisation tends to fail, or it happens at a sort of a community level, or it happens at a country or global level. At a global level, when it happens, it's sort of more important that values tend to can go out the window, and that becomes an issue of more disorientation, because when you've got a big drop off in performance, you get confused. What should I do? And what you're looking at then to go forward is to solve the issues that you have, that you see in a complex environment. Becomes more complex, appears more complex. What holds people together when information and rules sort of tend to disappear is values, and that what do you value becomes a central question for people. What is it you really value right now? If you're going to innovate right now, what do you value? What value are you going to give to somebody? Because what I value is my values. Are my values. That then goes into an organisation, which in most cases prior to today, and more than likely into the future, is that a company's values are what you have to put into a book or a chart that's up on the wall. And then that is buffeted around by whatever an advertising agency tells you. You should tell people that you value. So somehow their misguided interpretation of your values, it makes it, some sort of connection. So I then say something like, my supermarket are the fresh food people, or my bank is about more than money, and these ludicrous statements, when you stop and think about them from a values perspective, just don't make sense. How can a supermarket say we're a fresh food people? How can they do that? Because there's nothing fresh, really. Even the tomatoes are most probably 6 months old, or whatever they might be. But it's impossible to be the fresh food people when 80% of your stuff is processed. In a bank, it's like, more than money.
I think really what this comes down to, though, in terms of thinking big but starting small, is you've got to live your values, right? So if hypocrisy and untruth is something you stand against, then don't support companies that demonstrate that. And I think that's what we all have to do, right? We all have to take small little actions every day that are aligned to something bigger, but demonstrate our values and live our values. And I think if we can do that, I think we can have a much bigger impact than people realize. And it's been great to see many of the sort of shifts in lots of movements through COVID, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement here to recognize racial inequality in North America or throughout the globe, whether it's people sort of not supporting or calling Facebook out for not recognizing hate that they were supporting on their platform. This is where they're your values, right? I sold all my Facebook stock for the specific value that I didn't share the values that Mark Zuckerberg is demonstrating around supporting or not stamping out hate on Facebook as a platform. So that's not my value, so I don't own Facebook shares anymore. And that's the way I can defund them. Yeah. And anyone can do that. So I think that's the small action I would say for people to think about what they can do every day. But yeah, it's been great to join you on the podcast, and thank you very much for all these questions. I'm very excited to hear how your audience responds to this stuff. And again, they can reach out and chat to me, and on BarryOReilly.com, pretty much everywhere on the web. And it's a pleasure, Larry, for having a chance to chat to you today.
Wonderful, mate. Thanks so much for your time. And we'll speak again soon, hopefully.
I look forward to it. Cheers.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this Straight Talking the COVID Economy podcast. Thank you for listening. And please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. For more free content that will enhance your understanding of this new COVID economy and the actions that you can take to leverage disruptive change, join the Resilient Futures Network at www.resilientfutures.com/get-started. And please support our partner, Impact Africa Network, at www.impactafrica.network. We need all the support we can to help them build their own incubator. We know that there are many other great podcasts out there, and your time is precious, and you chose to listen to Straight Talk in the COVID Economy. And we appreciate that. Thank you.